Okay. Can you
Okay,
hear
so
me?
yes, I can hear you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
it is difficult to have an international conference like this. It's always there's always something going on.
Mhm.
Okay, Miss Carol, it's good to see you.
Same
And
here. Good to see you, Uki.
how are you today?
I am good. Despite everything that's happening, not just in the Philippines, but everywhere. But so far so good. I hope you're well, Uki. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it has been quite long since we
Yeah, that's
last
right.
met.
Mhm.
Okay, audience, if you have questions for Miss Carol, you can type them out in the chat box, and I'll read them out at the end of this segment. Okay, my first question for Miss Carol. Could you share with us on the situation of independent media and policy advocacy in the Philippines?
Okay. So first of all, again, thank you, Uki and Hadi, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and good evening to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who are joining us in this session. So I guess I'll start with a bit of context and an update also on what's happening in the Philippines, and perhaps some clarifications as well, because we're using the term policy advocacy. Perhaps in the Philippine context, and in particular for journalism, we call it more on, we refer to impact. But of course, it's the same idea as well. Um, Currently in the Philippines, I would say, and I guess this is also, there are some similarities also with other um, countries in the region. There's been a lot of limitations and restrictions given the pandemic in terms of access to information and freedom of expression. So that is kind of the general situation now, which of course, will have some indirect or direct effects as to how we're able to make impact or help contribute to change. But of course, I would say that we are thriving in the sense that reporters are able to manage and still be able to report from home. But of course, some have gone to field as well. But again, there's a lot of restrictions in terms of the current political environment as well. As you know, with the Duterte administration, our space has been restricted, not just the media, but also civil society. So that's kind of the general picture. So I would say there are a lot of limitations, but we are finding ways on how to still be able to do reporting and still monitor government.
And how is it compare these days in doing journalism, especially for doing the advocacy for trying to change policies in the Philippines compared to, for example, before Duterte?
Okay. I would say it would be on a case to case basis. It's hard to generalize by administration. Although, of course, I would say that the general environment now is that it's harder in a sense that our space is restricted. But it depends on the kind of advocacy or perhaps the issue that you are working on. So, for instance, I mentioned to you in our conversation earlier this morning that PCIJ, for instance, has done some work on contracting or procurement, precisely fostering transparency or more openness on procurement. Of course, still done through our investigative reporting and research. And this was done during the Duterte administration. But somehow we were able, well, not somehow, but we have made some headway in terms of, for example, in the Philippines, one agency which is called the Philippine Government Electronic Procurement System, or PhilGEPS, has adopted the recommendations that we made in our research, so that they're publishing more information now. So they're modernizing their system, adopting some of the recommendations that we made in our research. So it depends in the sense that it depends on which agency you're working with, or which agency you're seeking cooperation from. And it depends also on who's sitting in the office, because again, it can be very political. So that's kind of where we've made some headway. But I would also like to talk about another advocacy that PCIJ has been working on for, I think, almost 3 decades already, is the passage of the Freedom of Information Act. So we are part of the Right to Know Right Now coalition, which is a network of civil society organizations, including PCIJ, that has been pushing for the passage of the Freedom of Information Act. So that, in that regard, we haven't really made, we've made significant, we've made a lot of efforts before, but never really got to the passage of the law. So again, it depends. Here, our main the barrier here is, of course, you will do investigations, in particular, let's say, wealth of government officials, including legislators. So it's hard to expect them to pass such law that, might allow us to probe deeper into their wealth, for instance. So again, it's different stories. It depends on the kind of advocacy that you're working on and the agency that you're looking at as well.
And based on your experience for PCIJ, for since you have been in PCIJ, how long have you been in PCIJ?
I've been with the center for 13 years now.
13 years. That's
yes.
quite a while. And so since you joined the PCIJ, what areas of government policy that PCIJ have investigated and reported on? What are the themes that's usually being picked up by PCIJ and
right.
tends to be successful?
In the long term, so I would perhaps I can give you a brief rundown of where we would like to make impact as a news outlet focusing on investigative journalism. So of course, fighting corruption, promoting accountability, seeking accountability, exposing abuse of power, and of course fostering transparency. In terms of policy issues, of course, the long-term work that we've done, of course, is fostering transparency in government. So this is, I would say, this is where we've been able to make some impact in terms of our work with the International Budget Partnership on open budgeting. And as I mentioned earlier, on opening procurement or contracting, which is our project with HIBOS. But if we look at PCIJ's long history, of course, we've done corruption stories, audit of government agencies that have led to some impact. Like, for example, PCIJ's investigation into former President Joseph Estrada's unexplained wealth actually became part of the evidence in the impeachment case against former President Estrada. So it actually led to his it led to the impeachment of Estrada. So that is one, and then we also reported on the underperformance of the Philippine Ombudsman, and our report also was used in an impeachment case that eventually led to the official's resignation. So there are those kinds of stories also. So in a sense, we're able to expose the problem and also try to promote and seek accountability. But again, these kinds of stories aren't one-off, because going back, for instance, to the Estrada story, Estrada actually was pardoned and he became mayor of Manila, and he actually ran for president again in 2016 and in 2010, and he almost won. So it's a story that we have to continue monitoring, especially for uh, restricted democracies, or flawed democracies like the Philippines.
I see. Can you told me that you also doing on open contracting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about your work in open contracting?
Right. So PCIJ has been working on procurement stories or contracting stories for decades already. And that is primarily because we know that it is probably the most, if not the most important role of government in terms of delivering public services, public goods and services. But because of the big money involved here, it's also fraught with a lot of risks. So that's why in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, we focus a lot of our attention and resources in looking at government contracts, primarily because of the big money involved here. And of course, historically, it tells us that this is very prone to corruption as well. So, apart from the stories that we've been doing, the investigations, we also did research looking at the availability of contracting or procurement records in the Philippines and compare that vis-a-vis to global standards. Because if we look at standards, when we talk about procurement, typically we're only familiar, at least in the Philippines, the bidding and award. So that is usually what gets reported on, or perhaps when something happened already. Like, for example, a conflict of interest, or let's say a school building collapse. So it's more of the end part of the procurement process. But when we look at the contracting, it is a process that starts with, of course, planning, budgeting, and then you do the bidding, award, signing of the contract, implementation, and audit. So that's what we tried to look at, is trying to monitor where we can get records throughout the entire procurement process, because that would open up opportunities on how we can do better reporting on contracts or procurement. So in a sense, you don't have to wait for something bad to happen, because typically that, obviously that gets reported. We see that on the front page. But trying to understand that there are ways where actually you can prevent those projects from failing, is you're able to monitor them from the start or the planning stage.
From that project sounds interesting. Can you tell us about about how do you disseminate information? How do you for the open contracting?
Mm-hmm.
There are some, you have made some books, and also there's investigative reporting on televisions and everything. is there a very specific way that you about open contracting
Right.
that is very successful?
Thank you for that question. So of course, beyond publishing our reports and researches online, PCIJ does trainings as well, and of course we do in-person discussions with government actors as well. So, for instance, when I talked about how one agency called PhilJeps adopted the recommendations that we made in that study, that was born out of a series of meetings with PhilJeps. So we go there and present, this is our research and this is what we found out. And we have a list of recommendations that perhaps the agency might want to look into. So that's one way of how we're able to. So it's, of course, reach is important, that more people get to read your report and investigations, but also reaching people who can actually do something, or move the needle, push the needle. So that's also where that's also what we're looking at. And beyond that, also, I mentioned that we do trainings. So it's kind of, PCIJ's role in civic education. So um, we really are grateful for the opportunities to be able to share our lessons with, or our stories with our fellow reporters, um, and also students at the universities. So I think widening our reach, and also looking at specific communities where perhaps we can make more impact is, so that's kind of the strategy.
I see. That's interesting. You said that it's important to also connect not just to the common public, but also the one that could move the
Yes.
needle. You said.
Yes.
Yeah. So, based on your experience, what how do you measure whether PCIG's efforts, like investigative reporting or doing advocacy,
Yeah.
how do you measure the success, that whether something is successful?
Yeah, it's this is an ongoing conversation with us, because of course, it's, I mean, this is from my personal point of view. It's hard to measure success, in the sense that I know that it's not only PCIJ doing the work, because the work that we do, probably, a lot of other organizations before us have kind of laid the groundwork. So I'm trying to be mindful of that as well. But I think this is all, building up of efforts from other organizations and other actors as well. But I guess, if we are to be, going to be very specific about it, uh, some of the measures or indicators that we look at are, of course, beyond, looking at your reach, how many people read your story. Of course, that's one. Another thing, of course, is engagement. That's one thing that we're looking at. But of course, looking at quantitative and qualitative as well. And of course, as I mentioned, whether on a particular story or research that we did um, prompted people to act, or prompted government actors to act. So let's say that could mean holding a hearing about a particular issue, or perhaps drafting of a bill or passage of a bill, to address problems in an issue that we investigated on. So it could be different things. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it depends on the kind of story that really you are working on.
Okay, that's interesting. I've always seen some of the reports that being made by PCIJ is always very, it's not controversial, but it's very engaging, and that's and you also able to have many policymakers and also people from the political parties to also join in your investigation. You interview them. So how do you engage with them? How do PCIJ deal with policymakers and political parties when trying to advocate for a certain policy?
I think in this case, this is kind of a long-term work in a sense that you have to protect your integrity, and you have to make sure that you're able to, kind of have that level of trust with the public, and of course your readers in general. So I think that is number one, that you are a trusted organization, and that you're able to protect or maintain your integrity. So I think that is very important. But in terms of, more specifically, let's say if we're looking at procurement or budgeting, it's also important to have a track record. So, it's not like you just show up to their office and say, oh, we have this research, but actually, you've done your homework. So you have a track record, and that you really know what you're doing. I forgot to mention earlier that we've done some work also on campaign finance reporting. So this was not actually supposed to be, like an advocacy effort of PCIJ. It just so happened that, every 3 years we have our elections, and we know that campaign finance isn't reported on as much as we would have wanted. Reports on campaign finance to be done in the Philippines, both at the local and national level. But we just kept on reporting. Maybe after 3 election cycles, there came a point when our Commission on Elections actually reached out to us and asked us how we're doing monitoring of campaign finance, because this is something that our COMELEC is trying to do as well, maybe almost 5 or 6 years ago. So in a way, again, going back to my point earlier, that of course, beyond trust, integrity, it's also important to have a track record, that you actually know what you're doing, and you actually know what you are reporting on.
Do you have a specific strategy? For example, obviously, some of the themes that you're working on are very sensitive themes, like corruption. In order to have evidence of corruptions, you need to have certain documents that maybe the government or certain private companies are unable to provide to the public. And so, is there a specific approach on how do you get such sensitive information?
Right. That is very tricky, especially when we're talking of corruption stories. It's not like, you request a document and, it says there, corruption happened here. So it's a matter of really following the paper trail, following the money trail, and even that you might end up with nothing, because everything might be okay on paper. So typically what we do is, of course, we have to talk to a lot of insiders, talk to maybe former officials or people who really know about the issue. And then it's kind of a marriage of both paper and people trails. So that way you're able to make sense of, okay, so what's wrong with this picture? So it's, I would say, in any kind of, corruption story, it would be really hard, because of course people might want to hide what they've done, nobody would just, leave documents out there for people or for news organizations to see. But sometimes you'll be surprised as well because sometimes documents just don't make sense. Or if you look at, oh, I forgot to mention, beyond documents is use of data has been very essential in our work as well, because the difference with data is that it's not like, of course, when I talk about documents, could be, a myriad of things, but data allows reporters to check stories independently. So, this goes beyond the press releases or, the stories that agencies already provide to media in ready format. But with the use of data and other tools, data tools, we're actually able to do more independent reporting. And this is where I think where we've done a lot of significant findings in terms of, the more sensitive stories. So data and use of technology, I think, should be promoted. So data, recently we've been exploring spatial investigations using satellite imagery. So those things are all very helpful because, for instance, how can you hide what you've done, let's say, in a forest when, satellites can catch it? So, so these are things that, of course, you wouldn't get that from a document if you request from a department. But using, technology like access to satellite imagery can help you in your research.
So that's interesting. You also use technology. So can you tell us what's your recent innovative method of doing investigation? You mentioned earlier about using satellite images.
Mm-hmm.
What other innovation that's something that hasn't been done before, and doing some new things?
I would say, well, from my experience at PCIJ, of course, really I would say it's very basic in a sense that we just really try to look at data and try to make sense of data. But of course, that means, using Excel or my SQL to be able to manage large data sets. But of course, other things that we've done also is, I mentioned earlier, spatial investigations, or even using social media to investigate. Apart from that, beyond reporting itself, what we found helpful also is, right now, PCIJ is creating a platform where reporters can, it's like a Facebook, but for investigations. Because, of course, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can't really be in a physical office. And in light also of security threats, online security threats. So that's what we are working on now. So we are kind of adopting, we're learning a lot from the work of ICIJ, for instance, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. So we're kind of adopting what they're doing also. Not a technological innovation per se, but perhaps the idea of collaborations is also one thing that we see, to be part of a more regular part of PCIJ's portfolio. So apart from ICIJ, in the region, we're working, for instance, with several groups like Tempo, for instance, in Indonesia. Malaysia Kini also, right now, we have an investigative collaboration with the South China Morning Post. the Korean Times and Tempo, and has to do more with crimes committed online. So I think this is, of course, a recognition of, because investigations really take a lot of time and resources. So if you pull your resources together, I think, that can really, I saw one of my students in the chat here, so it just caught my attention. Hi, Loretta. So collaborations, I think, is one way to go as well. So beyond, of course, I talked about resources, pulling resources. I think it's also born out of the recognition that our problems actually, you might think that it's local, but it can be global in scale as well. So for instance, I talked about online crimes. So specifically, let's say online sexual exploitation of children. So the ones that are exploited are here in the Philippines, for instance, and the demand comes from, let's say, Australia or the United Kingdom. So again, these are stories that are cross-border. Or let's say we talk about, for example, from Indonesia, I know that palm oil plantations have, wreaked havoc in, your forests. But where does the palm oil go? So, probably, Nestle, Kellogg's, and these are consumed by people worldwide. So again, it's another cross-border story. So it really makes sense for reporters, for news outlets to do collaborations.
That's interesting. You mentioned about collaboration with other networks, but we'll get to that later. There's a question from Loretta Arroyo. She asked whether this is an interesting question. She asked whether using satellite imagery raises some privacy concerns.
Yeah,
because this also happens in Indonesia as well. Using satellite imagery is also you're also mapping other infrastructures that probably going to be critical about the government and also some private housings as well. So how do you address that?
Right. Thank you, Loretta. Hello. It's good to be in touch. I hope you and your classmates are well. Loretta was one of my top students. So she's been my student in several classes, and she's been great. So good question. Of course, these concerns are valid. So again, I guess the way that I would answer this is in any kind of technology or tool, similar to how we use the internet. It really depends on how you use it. So it can be for the bad or good. But I do acknowledge that there are privacy concerns. But I suppose it depends on the story or the method that you are employing. For example, in the example that I gave earlier, so for example, you are trying to investigate mining areas or monoculture plantations that are encroaching on ancestral domains or protected areas, or basically forest, timberland where there shouldn't be any mining operation or plantation. I think the public interest is very strong there. And I suppose there is probably no other way. Not that there is no other way, but it would be hard for you to see what's happening on ground if you are on ground, because definitely probably the companies wouldn't let you in, right? But with the use of satellite imagery, or again, as I mentioned, spatial investigative tools like using Google Earth Pro, you're able to look at what these companies are doing to our environment, to our forest, which of course, that in itself is a forest crime. So you are actually witnessing crime, and looking at it from the aerial point of view. So I think it depends again on what is your purpose, what is your goal. But of course, of course, I wouldn't be looking at private houses unless maybe I'm looking at private houses of a political figure. I don't know. Again, it depends on the kind of story that you're working on. But definitely, there are privacy concerns. So it has to be, you have to strike a good balance there. Thank you,
How about,
Loretta.
yeah, how about sensitive infrastructures, sensitive government infrastructures? Like, um, has there
Well,
been a problem?
I think if it's a public infrastructure, it's paid by taxpayers' money. It should be. I mean, at least for the Philippines, I think that that is considered public. So I'm not sure whether privacy, if there would be privacy issues there.
I mean, such as military headquarters and stuff.
Oh, okay, okay,
Yeah,
okay. Now, okay, now I think that's a different story because it could be a matter of national security
interest. Yeah.
or so. But again, I think we have to be more critical when governments say national security because sometimes they use it as a blanket,
Mm.
as a blanket provision that, oh, you can't look at this document, you can't look into this because it's a matter of national security. But perhaps we need more, a bit more explanation on that. But yeah,
Uh,
you're right. Of course, I wouldn't want, it depends. You wouldn't want other countries probably to look at, where your, your defense points are.
okay, I hope that answers the question, Loretta. So, you mentioned earlier about collaborating with networks around the world. Now, have PCIG ever collaborated with this network in Indonesia? You mentioned with Tempo earlier. Can you
Yeah.
tell us more about it? And has there been any other collaboration that you can tell us for the audience?
Yeah. PCIJ is a partner of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ. So we've done several stories with ICIJ about offshore leaks, Paradise Papers, offshore leaks, and recently the FinCEN files. And then part of that network also is in Southeast Asia. PCIJ is also part of Watchdog Asia. So this is a network of news organizations, so including Tempo, Malaysia Kini, including KCIJ or Newstapa, which is based in South Korea. So right now, we are. I mean, this is a current investigation actually. So I mentioned to you earlier that we're working on an investigation on online crimes. So that's a story that we're working with Tempo, the South China Morning Post, and the Korean Times. So we're seeing links between our countries. So that's what we're looking at. And apart from that, PCIJ, together with Tempo and Malaysia Kini, also will embark on reporting on COVID-19 stimulus. That has yet to happen, but we're looking forward to seeing the results of this collaboration. So
Okay.
we're excited that we're talking and that we're able to do stories together.
And is there any plan in the future for another collaboration with Indonesian? media or organizations?
I think this will be the start of more collaborations, I believe. So we're hoping to do that more in the future. And of course, here we recognize the fact that, again, I mentioned earlier, investigative reporting really takes a lot of resources. So it's we're happy to know that we're happy to know that institutions are open, or they accommodate funding these kinds of efforts.
Okay. So we're going to answer some questions from the chat box. Earlier, Hadi asked a question. He's interested in how to establish an independent and reputable media like the PCIJ. So probably going to look back at the history of PCIJ. How do you develop this independent and very reputable media? And how do you maintain to be trustful, you said, because a lot of people are willing to collaborate with you, because PCIJ is an entity that's very trusted by a lot of people.
Thank you for the question. I would say, I'm sorry, I might be repeating some of what I've said earlier already, but I think it's really important for an organization that, if you want to go the nonprofit route, so, meaning it's not like other mainstream news organizations that, are funded by advertisements. Not that it's bad, I know, because it's a business as well, but I think track record really is important, that you gain the trust of the public, that they know that you report on stories wherein public interest is your priority, and that is top priority. I think for PCIJ, what really helped secure where we are right now. Of course, we've done a lot of stories before on the environment, women and children. The Estrada investigation was really key, because it was it was big in a sense that you're able to understand that a news organization, a small organization like ours, can make impact in a sense that your reporting can actually be used in an impeachment case, and have this problematic president out of office. So I think that was really kind of big. So that got attention from a lot of people, including funding institutions. So that helped support and sustain PCIJ's work. So I think track record consistency is important also. So yeah, and of course, again, the being able to adapt to challenges also, and changes, especially now, with the internet and digital technology.
Okay, thank you. There's another point made by Opik. Opik made a point. This is what's happening in Indonesia, is that when you try to make advocacy through the media, there's sort of like very difficult, because many major media, the mainstream media, are also owned by political parties, so they tend to get biased in their reportings. And is this also happening in the Philippines as well? I mean, we heard that a couple of years ago there was a media that's being forced to shut down by the government. So how do PCIJ navigate this kind of environment?
Yeah, this is that is true. Like, for instance, ABS-CBN, which is the largest broadcast network in the Philippines, has actually shut down last year, during the pandemic, and you might have heard about threats against Rappler as well. I guess, of course, there are a lot of nuances here. There are a lot of backstories and context that we need to understand in each of these two cases. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that these stories are very much political as well. So, you will see, the invisible hands working here as well, because both organizations both news outlets have done critical reporting, as they should, on this government. The difference with PCIJ, of course, is again because we're not in the same status, in the sense that we are classified as an NGO, as a general classification. So the rules that apply to them, we don't, the same rules do not apply to, our organization compared to other organizations. That's right, Hadi. Siya is with ABS-CBN. So that's why that's very important. But I guess my answer there would be, because it will boil down to funding as well. So it's important to have a diverse source of funding. Because let's say, a classic example would be a politician would tell an advertiser, to no longer support or put ads in this particular newspaper. And if you, rely so much on that advertiser, then it would be, bad for your business. But if you have a diverse or multiple sources of funding, I think that might be a better way to go in terms of sustainability.
Okay. Another question. I don't know whether this is the question from Wahyu Ekash. This is
I saw it.
So the question you saw it as well. This is about this is probably something very local to Philippines. I'm not really sure I understand as well, but this is interesting to know about the political PCIG's opinion about environmental justice. Is the environmental is actually something very something that takes being concerned by the political parties in the Philippines?
Okay. Well, one thing about so I think Mr. Y, you mentioned PDP Laban, which is the political party of, if I'm not mistaken, of our president. But if we're going to talk about environmental policy of this particular administration, because when we talk about political parties in the Philippines, it is very different from the way we talk about political parties in the US, for instance, where they would really have ideologies. In the Philippines, that's not, our political parties are questionable in that regard. So politicians move from one political party to another, depending, which is in the majority, for instance. But if we're going to talk about, let's say, this current administration's policy on the environment, at least, from my observation and, from my reporting, it has been very duplicitous in a way that you would hear the president single out mining companies and threaten them in his speeches. He would, curse at various people and threaten them with more stringent or stricter laws and regulations. But those are just words. But when you look at policy or action, it doesn't necessarily match because, and I could, enumerate a number of things. So one is, we all know that we have to go the route of renewables already in terms of, energy, but we are still prioritizing coal in the Philippines. Another thing is we're very much aware of violations committed by mining companies. In fact, in 2016, Duterte appointed an environmental advocate in the name of Gina Lopez. So Gina Lopez ordered an audit of mining activities across the country, and that audit resulted in orders for closure and suspension of 28 mining companies because they've committed various violations, but that never happened. What the mining companies did is appeal before the president. So when they made the appeal, in effect, and eventually they were able to operate again. So that's another one. And another thing also is perhaps not directly, but this particular administration has wants to build. So we have a long list of infrastructure projects that they want to implement. But of course, all of these infrastructures would have, environmental impact as well. So I was just wondering, whether they're able to check how, they will manage its impact on the environment. Not that I'm against development, of course. Of course, we need roads, we need bridges. But a key thing to ask is how this would impact the environment.
That's interesting. I was wondering, does PCIJ also have like projects related to environmental lately?
Lately, we are part of the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Investigation Network. So a lot of my stories actually are from our work there. So we are working again with Tempo, and a journalist from the Amazon region and the Congo Basin also. So we're all doing stories on rainforest. So in particular, the drivers of deforestation in each of our countries and how we're all connected.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the question from the chat box. I have to be honest; it's very interesting to speak with you now. I've always wanted to be a journalist for a very long time, but somehow my fate turned me into another path.
But this is journalistic in a way also, because you're getting information from
investigative as well. So I was wondering whether this is going to be like like something very fun, but do you have any memorable experience while on your work in doing investigative? Because you're definitely going to have like some sort of stories from your experience. So can you tell us about what's the one thing that you always remember?
I guess for me, some of my memorable stories, or some like unforgettable moments in my journalism experience so far would be when we do field work, because sometimes it just surprises you what you see when you go to field. So there was this one story that we're looking at a piece of land that former President Arroyo sold in Bulacan. And we didn't find a lot from documents. So of course, it's kind of a triangle. So you do interviews, you do paper trail, and then the third one would be seeing it for yourself. And then we were just surprised. And when we got there, it led us to several other leads that this particular, the land is actually near a property of the mayor, and that they just, paved the road leading to this particular land, and that prices have actually gone down in that area, and yet the former president was able to sell the land at a high rate. So there are a lot of leads there. So again, it just surprises you when you go to field. So those are just some of my memorable experiences, the surprises that journalism bring you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've always wanted to experience such excitement on finding some new stuff, and then when something gets stuck, and then you suddenly found something just came to you. That's interesting. Well, okay, that was the last question we had for today's program. Miss Karol, thank you very much for your time with us at ritabaru.co. We hope to keep in touch with you. So I hope that
Thank you.
I hope you and your family are going to be will be okay over there. And thank you very much.